Quiet bunch this morning. Everybody's awake, I take it. Good to have everybody. We're in Acts chapter 24. We're going to look at the questions here on our workbook, page 25, Paul's hearing before Felix. And we'll look at those and then probably get into chapter 25 a little bit. And then Wednesday night, we'll have the questions on chapter 25, which are on the next page, page 26. Albert, you care to lead us in prayer before we get started?
Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day that you've given us, and so thankful for all that you do for us. We ask you to be with Steve as he leads this class, and be with us that we can receive the message and look for applications within our life. We ask you to forgive us of any sins we might have committed. We ask you to be with those who are sick. We ask you to go with us always, and in the end, bring us home to be with you. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Albert did a very good job covering this chapter on Wednesday night. It was a very interesting chapter. We learn a lot about Roman government in this chapter and who the governor was at this time, or procurator as they were called. Actually, Rome has sent several procurators between Pilate and Felix. Pilate was recalled by Rome 3 years after he allowed Jesus to be crucified on the cross, about 36 AD, and was removed from office. And there was 2 or 3 or maybe 4 procurators that served short terms between 36 AD and around 52 AD when Felix took office. And so, as has been pointed out, Palestine wasn't a real favorite place for Roman officials to have to serve. And although some of the procurators were removed for misconduct, one wonders if a lot of them weren't assigned to this area because of previous misconduct in other areas as kind of a punishment. But be that as it may, Felix is the one that is in Caesarea, and to whom Claudius Lysias, the Roman officer who manned the garrison in Jerusalem, sent Paul with an accompanying letter. And this is something to keep in mind. How thorough, and we pointed out Lysias's shortcomings in not revealing the entire truth about his dealings with Paul. But what basically did Lysias impart to Felix?
I gave Paul due process, which under Roman law was necessary. He said, when I found out he was a Roman citizen, I gave him protection due a Roman citizen.
Yeah. And from the tenor of Lysias's letter, do you think Lysias thinks Paul is an enemy of the state of Rome? No. Mm-mm. Yeah, just the very tenor of the letters. First of all, if you look at verse 27 of chapter 23, he's taken by the Jews, and he was going to be killed by them. And then I came in with an army and rescued him. Well, that was a little stretch of the truth, but in the final analysis, he was rescued. And then, as soon as I learned that he was a Roman citizen, I demanded that these people that were accusing him be brought forth to a council. And then, after reviewing their charges against him, it was obvious that he hadn't done anything against Rome. This all had to do with their own Jewish law that we really don't have anything to do with. And then I learned of this assassination attempt on him. So as a result, I'm sending him in protective custody to you to let you judge the matter. That's basically it in a nutshell. Now, coming to chapter 24, who did not have privy to this information? This is real important as we see how the events of chapter 24 and 25 unfold. Who had no knowledge of this letter that Lysias sent to Felix? Absolutely. The Jews. Tertullus didn't know about this letter. The chief priest or high priest didn't know about the letter. All these Jewish accusers from Asia or wherever they were from that went up to Caesarea to make all these accusations against Paul, they didn't know anything about it. And so as we look at the beginning of Paul's address to Felix, how did Paul address Felix? It's over in, let's see here.
First of all, with respect.
Yes.
And so these accusations, they can't prove.
Right. Yeah, there was one, let's see, where is it? Oh, yes, verse 10, chapter 24. Then Paul, after the governor had beckoned to him to speak, answered, "Forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do more cheerfully answer for myself, because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem for to worship." Paul reminds Felix that I know that you have been many years a judge unto this nation. Paul knows that Felix has received this letter, and Paul knows that Felix knows the conniving attributes of the Jews and high priest and so on and so forth, how they like to take advantage of some of the privilege that they have in assisting the Romans and who they appoint as governor of Palestine and this sort of thing. And so basically Paul says, Felix, I know you know my accusers, and you know what kind of people they are. And this plays a big role in how things kind of develop as the story goes on. So I want to point that out because the things that Tertullus is saying to Felix, Felix immediately knows isn't true because of the letter that he received from Lysias. Okay? That still doesn't excuse Felix, because what did he do with Paul? Kept him in prison. Well, house arrest, you might say. Let him have visitors and so forth. But 2 years later, Felix himself gets recalled to Rome and gets deposed, and Festus comes in. And did Felix turn Paul loose after these 2 years? No, he didn't. And of course, Festus and Agrippa didn't, because Paul in the meantime appeals to Caesar. But anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting to kind of consider. Let's look at our questions here just a minute. Who was Tertullus? A lawyer. Exactly. What 3 charges did he make against Paul? Yeah, he's a pest. Okay, what else was he? Tried to profane the temple. Ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Actually, if you've ever studied this back before and used Brother Harkrider's workbook, this has been around forever. He found 4 charges, and the 4th one was what? Yeah, he was an insurrectionist. He was stirring up the Jews all over the world. So there are actually 4 charges that they bring against him. And before whom were these made? Who's hearing the charges? Felix, okay. And what was the official position of the one hearing him? What was Felix's official position? Yeah, governor or procurator. Okay. Now here's another twist to the story. Who was Felix's wife? Drusilla. I don't know that it's revealed in the scripture, but history has it that this was Felix's 2nd marriage, that he ditched his first wife for Drusilla, or actually caused Drusilla to leave her first husband. Okay. Drusilla was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I. See how all this gets intertwined? So Drusilla was a Jewess, and Felix is a Roman, and they're husband and wife. So here is another connection that we have in which Felix is going to have firsthand knowledge of Jewish customs, Jewish law, Jewish religious practices, and all this sort of thing, because his wife was a Jew. Okay? Now, another interesting thing about this is when Festus comes to power, who was the other leader that was with him that he suggested hear Paul's case after he thought he was innocent? Which one? Herod Agrippa II. Okay, and Festus and Herod Agrippa II, well, actually, I think Herod Agrippa II was the one who said, if Paul hadn't appealed to Caesar, we might as well set him free. Well, Herod Agrippa II was Drusilla's brother. Getting to be like Peyton Place, isn't it? You thought Peyton Place was something new and unique. So Herod Agrippa II's sister was Felix's wife. Okay, so you see all these connections. And when Paul was speaking to Herod, he said, what did he tell Herod about his knowledge of what Herod's knowledge of the prophets was? I know you know the prophets, of course, because he was somewhat of Jewish. He was an Edomite. Herod the Great was an Edomite, but had Jewish blood, had common ancestry back to Abraham. So anyway, Herod Agrippa knew Jewish law, and Paul was expounding to him, when we get over to that part of the story, about how Jesus, he doesn't say it in so many words in the text, but he covered this, how Jesus will fulfill the law of Moses, and he fulfilled the prophets and so forth. And he said, Herod, I know you know the prophets. And then Herod's famous line was, almost. We'll talk about that when we get to that place in the chapter, what that word that's translated in the King James, almost, and how it's translated in the New American Standard, the Revised Standard, has a little bit different twist to it, but we'll talk about that when we get to that text. Okay. Number 24, when Christianity was referred to as the sect of the Nazarenes, what was implied in the understanding of Paul's accusers as to the relation of Christianity and Judaism? Mm-hmm. Yeah. They didn't recognize Christianity as the fulfillment of the law of Moses. It was just another sect, S-E-C-T, sect of the Jews, just like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes and the Zealots and the Herodians, and go on and on and on and on and on. It was just another Jewish denomination, we'll call it, if you want to look at it in terms of modern usage. So they thought, well, it's just another sect of Judaism. It's a heretical sect of Judaism. These Christians, they're Nazarenes. They follow these strange customs and talk about the resurrection of the dead and how Christ was raised from the dead, and he was their ringleader. Now Paul is propagating all this silly doctrine that's going around. So they thought it was a sect of Judaism. What gave Paul cheer as he made his defense? Yes. That's what we just talked about. We started the class. Felix was experienced in dealing with the Jews. And by the way, Felix is in his 7th year as being governor when Paul appears before him. So he's not a new hire, just learning the ropes. He has been dealing with the Jews for 7 years. So this story takes place in approximately 58 AD. So Felix was removed from office in some place, say 59, depending on how you count the years. He was procurator from 52 to around 59 or 60 AD. All right, summarize Paul's reply to each charge made against him. Yeah. He said, I've been as quiet as a mouse here in Jerusalem. I was going about my business, keeping to myself. I was fulfilling a vow in the temple with some Jewish brethren, and here these Jews come in and say I've defiled the temple with a Greek. I didn't take any Greek into the temple grounds. And all these charges against him basically were just made up charges and made by false witnesses. If you're doing your daily Bible reading, you're up to the story of Ahab. And what was it Ahab wanted real bad? Naboth's vineyard. And so he wanted it so bad that when Naboth told him, well, I can't possibly sell this vineyard to you. It's part of my family inheritance. It's been in my family. We'll just say, we'll make this up, but in my family for generations. It just wouldn't be right for me to sell it to you. There's no price that could buy it, in other words. And so Ahab kind of goes home sulking and goes to bed, turns his head to the wall and won't eat. And so Jezebel comes in, and what did she say? And not only that, if you won't, I will. Don't worry about it. The deal is good and done. So how did, if you can recall the story, how did Jezebel get rid of Naboth? Remember? How did the Jews try to get rid of Christ before their council? Yeah. So she gets these guys, the lowest of the low in the community, said, go pay these guys some money and go down there and have two of you say that you've heard Naboth blaspheme God and the king. And so they called Naboth before the council, and these two witnesses come up and apparently accuse him of that, and they just take Naboth out and stone him. So unlike Jesus' trial, where none of the witnesses could agree on anything, at Naboth's hearing, both of the witnesses said, yes, I heard him blaspheme God. So they took him out and stoned him. So Jezebel comes back, says, go down and get your vineyard. It's all yours. So you see how false witnesses were used from time immemorial in carrying out the skullduggery of evil rulers and evil leaders and so forth, and actually had many innocent people killed. Take Stephen, for example. I mean, they didn't call any witnesses against him. They just said he blasphemed, and they all just took him out and stoned him. So Paul is defending himself against all of these charges, including those of the false witnesses, as Ron pointed out. So what did Felix decide concerning Paul? Yes. Well, let's put this on hold. So how long was the case on hold? Over 2 years. So the question is, was there really any reason to wait for Lysias to come? He already told him everything he needed to know. There was no need for it. So he's just putting off the Jews. That's why I said these Jews were not privy to this letter that Lysias. So the Jews actually thought Lysias needed to come. So actually, Felix somewhat, I guess, did Paul a favor in maybe getting the Jews off his back for at least 2 years, because we don't read about during this 2-year period them harassing and bringing more witnesses and making demands. Paul was just kind of left alone there in Herod's palace, I guess, or wherever they kept him, imprisoned, if you will, for 2 years. So what treatment was accorded Paul?
He could have visitors. They could just minister. He just couldn't leave.
Yeah. Apparently he had a fairly free course there in Caesarea, and who might have visited him? No, there's nothing in Scripture to say this. I just want you to think and speculate.
He could just, in theory, like when he was in prison in Rome, that he could have visitors, he could teach.
Yeah.
They gave him the flexibility, as long as he didn't leave, that anyone could come to see him.
Yeah.
So he could teach and preach and all of that as long as they came to him.
Absolutely. What other Bible characters connected with Caesarea who became Christians or who were Christians could have visited Paul while he was in Caesarea? One of them sent to Joppa for a man named Peter, who was to come and tell him things that he needed to do. Cornelius. He was a centurion. Maybe he was one of Paul's guards. I'm just guessing. I mean, it's interesting to think about. Cornelius could have visited Paul while he was in prison at Caesarea. Who else? Who had 4 daughters who prophesied?
Steve?
Philip. Yeah. In fact, they stopped at Philip's house on the third journey coming back to Jerusalem when everybody's telling, don't go, they're going to kill you or imprison you or whatever. And I remember Agabus came up and prophesied about, took Paul's girdle and demonstrated, the one who owns this or his belt is going to have this punishment inflicted on him, or this is going to happen to him. He's going to be bound when he gets to Jerusalem. Yeah, Philip could have visited him. So just stuff like that's interesting to think about. There's no scripture for it, but it's just some coincidence. Paul's there for 2 years. You would think, as well known as he was in the Christian community, that Cornelius might have called on him, Philip may have called on him, others may have that we don't know about. Okay, discuss Paul's approach to preaching to Felix and Drusilla. What were the 3 bullet points of Paul's sermon to Felix and Drusilla?
Talk to him about judgment.
Yes. They preached on da-da-da, da-da-da, and da-da-da-da. What was the first one? Righteousness, temperance. Now, why would that be an interesting topic to discuss with, based on what we know already, Felix and Drusilla?
Well, having knowledge of the old law, they would be keenly aware that God would have judgment.
How about their social situation that we discussed briefly?
Their second marriage.
Yeah, they were in an adulterous marriage, based on what the text says, at least it's strongly implied. And so here you have Paul he was preaching what they needed to hear, or he was presenting the gospel in a manner that would touch them, because once they knew what the gospel message said, they would realize their own situation. And that, I guess that's really shouldn't that be the way we approach anybody with the gospel? Or once the gospel is even preached in its generic form, if you want to call it that, and a person thinks about it and makes personal application, they would come to the same conclusion. So he preached on righteousness and temperance and judgment to come. And there's many scriptures that could be looked at on all those topics. We won't take time to do that, but Brother Harkrider in his workbook says if he preached on righteousness, he told them about the gospel and maybe some of the things he told the Romans in Romans 1:16. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ because it's the power of God to salvation. He might have told them about salvation by grace through faith that he also told the Romans in Romans 3, and obedience of faith in Romans 6, and the importance of baptism. So speaking to them as Felix being a Roman, Paul's telling Felix some of the same things he tells the Roman brethren when he writes the book of Romans, okay, more than likely. And then in temperance, he would tell them about self-control and about not yielding to sin and about the works of the flesh that he told the Galatian brethren. And then about judgment, there's an appointed day for judgment, as Paul told the Athenians there in Acts chapter 17. Everyone will give an account at the judgment, 2 Corinthians 5:10, and those who have, everyone will be rewarded according to their works. Again, Romans 2:6-11. So all these things may have been touched upon, but the result was Felix.
Was frightened.
Yeah.
Sling away and said,
Yeah.
"No."
Yeah, he said when he verse 25, when he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment, Felix trembled and answered, "Go your way, for this time when I have a convenient season, I'll call for you." And why was it he wanted to call for him in verse 26?
He wanted a bribe, money, and then thinking that he would get paid off.
Absolutely. Felix said, Paul, you're a Roman citizen. You know what we Roman officers require if you want to get what you want. You know, there's a price, and I'm perfectly willing to accept, you know, a reasonable payoff to set you free. So anyway, that again kind of reflects. Now say that again. Well, now that brings up a good point. Why do you suppose Felix thought Paul might have the money to pay him off? Well, not only that, what had Paul just carried back to Jerusalem? Yes, all the money that the churches that he visited throughout Asia and Asia Minor and Macedonia and so forth had made offerings to help relieve the needs of the needy saints. And of course, they'd set all these individuals back with Paul to guarantee that supposedly that the money got to where it needed to go. And so Felix may have heard about this. Man, Paul's been moving a lot of money from other parts of the empire bound here to Jerusalem. Maybe he still got some of that. He can pay me off. And so that was a good point, Greg, because the churches were not trying to bail Paul out specifically, but Felix knew that he had the money from churches that was supposed to be used for other purposes that perhaps he could lay his hands on. So that's tells you a little bit more about Felix's character. Well, which is the next question. Actually, I didn't remember that. What was his character?
Well, it was curious, but he really wasn't somebody breathing Paul.
Yeah, he was. He did not enjoy a good reputation about being a nice person. He was very greedy, power seeker. He was thirsty for power and so forth that his office provided him. And then Brother Taylor asked, was he honest? No, not really. He wasn't a real popular governor. And he was recalled also. Usually the recall came when the people complained enough to Rome, and the Caesar then would send somebody else to take their place. But you have to give him some credit. He did protect Paul. I mean, he wasn't one of these like Pilate. Well, I'll just wash my hands of this. You guys do with Paul whatever you want to, because Paul was a Roman citizen. And if he knew that he had just turned him over to the Jews, he would have to answer to Caesar for that and Roman law, and the consequences of that would not be good for Felix. And so he was, we don't really know if he was caring for Paul in this way because he really had concern for Paul, or he was only doing it for his own benefit because he didn't want to get in trouble with the higher authorities. But be that as it may, he did keep Paul safe. Is there any reason to believe that he ever intended to consider the gospel again? These are one of these speculation questions Brother Taylor throws in from time to time. Do we see any evidence he ever? Yeah, he did send for him oftener and communed with him, but nothing apparently ever came of any of that. It says, but after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room or position, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So Felix could have turned Paul loose. He'd heard his case. He had Lysias's testimony, and he knew that these charges against Paul were false, were not worthy of Roman imprisonment, I'll put it that way. So he could have set Paul free, but he didn't, because he didn't want to aggravate the Jews anymore. Mainly because he was probably trying to hang on to his position, which he lost anyway, but be that as it may. Any thoughts on anything up to this point? We have one more question, I think, on chapter 24. What two motives did Felix have for continuing to hold Paul?
Doing a favor for the Jews and hoping for money.
Yeah, he was hoping the longer I hold Paul, Paul's going to give out or give in eventually, and he's going to pay me some money, and then I'll let him out. So he was hoping against hope that Paul would finally post bail, if you will, and be let out of jail. And then the second reason was keeping him in prison just kept the Jews happy, and he had less problems with them to have to deal with. So, really? What gave you that idea, Greg? Oh my. Okay, that's chapter 24. Interesting chapter. Interesting to some of these little sidelines that we run across.
I think it's interesting to show how the Apostle Paul was a master at looking at every situation that he came into. How could he preach the gospel in all those situations? By using his Roman citizenship, he was presented an opportunity to talk before governors and then eventually kings.
Mm-hmm.
And God had told him he was going to provide him those opportunities. But Paul, every time he saw an opportunity, okay, he was accused of doing this. He said, "But I'm going to tell you what I really am doing."
Mm-hmm.
And he went in and explained how about Jesus and everything and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So it just shows that if you look at your situation, usually there's a way that we can influence in some way
Mm-hmm.
good in God's kingdom. I think that Paul was, he had 2 years now because of what he did, and of course the grace of God.
Mm-hmm.
He had 2 years that he could actually continue to preach and teach the gospel.
You know, another interesting thing to think about is what possibly, well, for one thing, Paul preached to Felix and Drusilla. What else could have done to convince them that they needed to obey the gospel that he didn't do? Okay. You don't read any miracles. You don't read after, well, maybe bitten by the viper when they were shipwrecked. That's about the only miracle that you read in this part of Paul's ministry. You don't read about him healing the sick like the other apostles did, like Peter and John healing lame men and healing others, raising Tabitha from the dead, and all that sort of thing. That Paul didn't. Paul relied on the gospel message to speak for itself, and he didn't need to constantly confirm the fact that he was an apostle of Christ. He was the ultimate example of an apostle, all the things that he had to deal with. And that was another thing. Remember, when I did the invitation this month, I talked about the 6 or 7 times that Jesus personally appeared to Paul during his personal ministry. You don't read about that with the other apostles because Jesus was with them all the time, but Jesus was constantly giving Paul words of encouragement when he was in these tight positions. And he was telling him what his mission was going to be. You're going to be preaching, you're going to be taking the gospel to Rome. And all these events that happened to him are facilitating him getting to Rome. Now, could have some kind of a miracle have been performed and suddenly Paul's in Rome? Well, yeah, that could have happened, but it didn't. And they're letting the natural course of human events and the providence of God get Paul to where the Lord wants him to be. And I think that's quite impressive to me, at least. Any other thoughts?
So wonderful about having been
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, while he was in prison, he wrote the prison epistles. Well, another thing I was thinking about a minute ago, what other apostle was in prison, but to get him on the course he needed to go, it was necessary for, well, you can say, well, it's Paul in Philippi, but prior to that, which apostle was liberated from prison at least twice? Peter. Okay. And so God miraculously got Peter out of prison so he could preach his gospel. God is intentionally keeping Paul in prison so he can preach the gospel where he wants it preached. So that's another kind of an odd thing to kind of think about. All right, well, let's get into chapter 25 here. It's a fairly short chapter. And Ron, why don't you read the first 9 verses for us there?
Verse 9.
1 through 9.
Now, when Festus was coming to the province, after 3 days, he ascended to Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him, and desired favor against him that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. Let them therefore, said he, which among you are able to go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. And when he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood around about, and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, answered Paul and said, Wilt thou go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me?
Okay. Okay. So Festus is now the Porcius Festus, his full name, is now the governor. And he apparently is in Jerusalem. Maybe he was there for one of the feast days. We don't really know why he was there. And he's getting ready to return to Caesarea when these Jews approach him and make all these complaints against Paul. And as to his credit, and also Felix had the same position, these Jews want Paul brought back to Jerusalem. How's Festus respond to that? Initially.
You can come to Caesarea with me.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we're not going to bring him down here. You come to Caesarea and make your complaints. So they have their court, very brief synopsis of the court hearings in just 2 verses. In Caesarea, all these false accusations that they couldn't prove, and Paul's denial. But Festus, what did he say? Was he as firm as Felix in maintaining that Paul stay in Caesarea? Festus apparently was a very weak leader. I mean, when I say a weak leader, he really didn't have a whole lot of backbone. He tried to please the Jews at every opportunity, and he didn't want any trouble, and he just wanted things to stay calm. And so, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, he has said, Paul, would you please go to Jerusalem and there be judged before me? These Jews are just driving me crazy. Could you help me out here and let's go to Jerusalem? And which prompts Paul, we'll read this, but prompts Paul to do what? I don't have the governor on my side like I did when Felix was governor. Obviously, Felix didn't share the letter that he received from Lysias and all his communing that he did with Paul, obviously, he either didn't share that with Festus or it didn't make adequate impression on Festus. And so Festus knows about these plans to try to assassinate Paul. And still he says, would you go to Jerusalem and hear these things before him? So let's read 10 through 12. Marilyn, you want to read that?
But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing for their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. And Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go.
Okay, so Paul says, I'm being, the accusations brought against me are being heard in the wrong court. All these charges are false in the first place, but even if any of them were true, it should be heard by a Roman governor because I haven't violated any Roman law. And so to really clear my name, the only place I'm going to get a fair hearing is appealing to Caesar. And so that's what he does. And Festus says when he had conferred with the council, I'm not sure if that's the council of the Jews or Roman officials. If you've appealed to Caesar, then to Caesar you will go. So this sets up then the interchange that Paul is going to have now with not only Festus, but with King Agrippa. So let's read 13 through the end of the chapter. Who's got a real strong voice and can read it in 2 minutes? Jeff, you have a strong voice. You have 2 minutes. Read 13 through 27.
Now, when several days had passed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived in Caesarea, paying their respects to Festus. And while they were spending many days there, Festus presented Paul's case to the king, saying, there is a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix. And when I was in Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I replied to them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any prisoner before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. So after they assembled here, I did not delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal in order that the man be brought. When the accusers stood up, they did not begin bringing any charges against him of crime that I suspected, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about the dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. And being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered that he be kept in custody until I sent him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself tomorrow. He said, you shall hear him. So on the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice came amid great pomp and entered the auditorium, accompanied by the commanders and the prominent men of the city, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought before them. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all your gentlemen present with us, you see this man about whom all the people of the Jews appealed to me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had committed nothing deserving death. And since he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to send him. Yet I have nothing to find about him to write to my Lord. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the investigation has taken place, I may have something to write. For for it seems absurd to me that sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him as well.
That sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? Like I said, there's subtle humor all through Scripture when you read some of these situations. So here Festus is. He's a Roman officer. He doesn't know anything about these Jews except they are always causing him trouble. And so he goes into this with Agrippa. He says, I've called this man in my court. I've listened to these people complaining about him. All they're complaining about is these religious matters, these superstitions about this man Jesus, and they say he's dead, and Paul says he's alive, and he wants to go to Caesar, and I don't have any charges to write, and I need some help. So really, he just wants Agrippa to tell him what charges he should write in a letter to send with Paul to Caesar. Because really, it doesn't seem right. Somebody appeals to Caesar, and here the governor that's sending him doesn't even have the wherewithal to send what the charges are against him. So that's kind of where we leave the story at this point. So Agrippa, being more familiar with the Jews and also being a puppet ruler of the Roman government, he kind of has his foot on both sides of the aisle and can maybe sort things out for Festus. So when Festus writes his letter to Caesar, who, by the way, was Caesar at this time? If I was Paul, I don't know if I'd want to appeal to this guy. That's why Jeff's translation calls the emperor. Augustus was just a term like Pharaoh. It just meant emperor. It wasn't the person's actual name. Nero was emperor. Would you want to stand before Nero? But anyway, that was who the emperor was at this particular time. So that's why Paul is now before King Agrippa. So you see how the close interaction between the rulers that are judging Paul, their relationship to the Jews, their knowledge of Jewish law, and their dealings with the Jews in the past, all these things are things that are interacting either in pure view or under the table or subconsciously or whatever in all these dealings with Paul. It's very fascinating when you stop and think about it, I think. So, Jeff, you Wednesday night, do the questions on 25 and probably get into 26 some. Okay, thanks.